One of the most challenging problems plaguing the world today is corruption in the public sector. Nearly every country in the world has some level of corruption, but in some countries, such misconduct is much more pervasive. Corruption can come in the form of bribery, nepotism, attacks on the press, bureaucratic red tape, inadequate financial disclosure, exploitation of one's office, and much more. Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index determines the most corrupt countries in the world, and it is a measure reflecting perceived levels of public sector corruption. So in this video, we will be considering the most corrupt countries in terms of Corruption Perceptions Index. At number 10 is Burundi, with a Corruption Perceptions Index of 19 over 100, and it ranks 169 over 180, staying the same as its 2020 score of 19 over 100. Corrupt practices in Burundi persists, mainly due to insufficient controls on corruption. As controllers, the persons tasked with overseeing corruption at national and local levels also reproduce the same dynamic of corruption under scrutiny. Burundi citizens' weak level of confidence in the state encourages them to accept bribery in the face of authority. As the government has been and still is discredited by the public, loyalty is more towards social networks than public institutions. At number 9 is Equatorial Guinea with a Corruption Perceptions Index of 17 over 100, and it ranks 172 over 180. It stepped up by 1 point from 2020's score of 16 over 100. Political corruption in Equatorial Guinea is high, and it has been described as an almost perfect kleptocracy, in which the scale of systemic corruption and the ruler's indifference towards the people's welfare place it at the bottom of every major governance indicator or ranking, below nations with similar per capita GDPs. Many government officials in Equatorial Guinea have amassed great wealth during the country's oil boom. Many experts believe these officials have potentially illegally taken from public oil revenue, causing a series of money laundering investigations that support suggestions of corruption. In addition to monetary corruption, evidence exists of several other corruptive practices within Equatorial Guinea's government that prevent alleviation of poverty and the overall improvement of living conditions within the country. At number 8 is Libya, with a Corruption Perceptions Index of 17 over 100, and it ranks 172 over 180, staying the same as its 2020 score of 17 over 100. Corruption is still endemic in this country. The nation's natural resources have even encouraged this, as Libya has the largest crude oil reserves in Africa. Corruption in Libya began during Gaddafi's rule from 1969 to 2011. A total of $65 billion of Libya's wealth fund, the Libyan Investment Authority, was held in private accounts instead of going towards public expenditures. While Gaddafi's regime was profiting off of Libya's national assets, more than 40% of the Libyan population lived below the poverty line. Libya has anti-corruption laws. However, lax enforcement permits widespread corruption practices, such as embezzlement and bribery among the public procurement sector. At number 7 is Yemen, with a Corruption Perceptions Index of 16 over 100, and it ranks 174 over 180. It stepped up by 1% from 2020's score of 15 over 100. Corruption in Yemen is a highly serious problem. Yemen is the most corrupt country in the Gulf region, and it is also the poorest country in the Middle East. The brutal civil war plunged the country into an unprecedented humanitarian crisis and decimated the country's economy, which isn't helped by widespread nepotism that impedes any attempt at investment in the country. Deep-rooted corruption is hampering any meaningful attempt at recovery, and extortion and passive bribery are both legal and common practice. At number 6 is North Korea, with a Corruption Perceptions Index of 16 over 100, and it ranks 174 over 180. It made a 2-point drop from 2020's score of 18 over 100. Corruption from the top down is a key feature of life in North Korea, where human rights are virtually non-existent. Rights to basic amenities and feeding in North Korea depends on the ability of individuals to bribe officials. It was reported that bribery is effective in North Korea, and in order to lead a comfortable life, you have to bribe your way. The constant threat of arrest and prosecution provides officials with a powerful means to extort money and other favors from people desperate to avoid detention. In addition, the living conditions and treatment of detainees can also depend on the payment of bribes. And number 5 is Afghanistan, with a corruption perceptions index of 16/100, and it ranks 174/180. It made a 3-point drop from 2020's score of 19/100. Afghanistan continues to deal with systemic corruption and the threat of Taliban violence. Family ties and tribal connections are especially strong in the country, making nepotism a massive issue. In Afghanistan today, corruption most often takes the form of demanding and offering bribes, both in the private and public sectors, and on large and small scales. There are also many other major forms of corruption, including nepotism, graft, and illegal land transfers. It is estimated that over half of the nation's annual customs revenue is lost to graft. And number 4 is Venezuela, with a corruption perceptions index of 14/100, and it ranks 177/180. It made a 1-point drop from 2020's score of 15/100. The level of corruption in Venezuela is very high by world standards and is prevalent throughout many levels of Venezuelan society. Discovery of oil in Venezuela in the early 20th century has worsened political corruption. The large amount of corruption and mismanagement in the country has resulted in severe economic difficulties. Bribery, theft of public money, and nepotism are commonplace in government and the police force. Bribery and facilitation payments are widespread. Gifts given in return for an undue advantage are illegal under Venezuelan law. However, the practice is recurrent in most sectors. And number 3 is Somalia, with a corruption perceptions index of 13/100, and it ranks 178/180. It stepped up by 1 point from 2020's score of 12/100. Somalia ranks among the world's most corrupt countries. Corrupt government officials tolerate illegal activities in return for bribes. The governing elite is continuously involved in allegations of embezzlement of public funds. Bribery is commonplace in all sectors, and procurement contracts frequently involve corruption. Several forms of corruption are illegal in the country. However, implementation of the law is non-existent, and Somalia is rife with embezzlement, abuse of office, and bribery. And number 2 is Syria, with a corruption perceptions index of 13/100, and it ranks 178/180. It made a 1-point drop from 2020's score of 14/100. The war-torn nation remains a wholly corrupt country. The war started in 2011 when Syrians, enraged by corruption, took to the streets to demand democratic accountability from their leaders. The protest started in March that year and quickly morphed into an armed insurgency and eventually a full-blown war. Widespread and accepted bribery of government officials created distrust of the Syrian government. Dealing with corrupt officials became an everyday part of life, as simple interactions with police officers or attempts to get licenses required to operate businesses would inevitably be accompanied by requests for unofficial payments. At number 1 is South Sudan, with a corruption perceptions index of 11/100, and it ranks 180/180. It made a 1-point drop from 2020's score of 12/100. Corruption in South Sudan is among the worst in the world. The nation's elites have developed a kleptocratic system that controls every part of the South Sudanese economy. According to reports, the nation has lacked regulations to combat frauds and malfeasance among the government officials. South Sudan's public officials have stolen untold amounts of public money, and anti-corruption legislation isn't enforced. Now you have an idea of the most corrupt countries in the world and what their CPI scores are. That brings us to the end of this video. Remember to hit the subscribe button. Do not forget to like, share, and comment on this video. See you in the next video.